Sir Isaac Newton is recognized as one of the most outstanding scientific intellects of all time. His elucidation of the laws of motion and gravity has effectively created the modern world and what's known today as space travel. Though many do not know that what led him to this understanding was his secret study of the Hermetica, an ancient occult esoteric religion that originated in Egypt by the likes of the ancient Egyptian Greek god Hermes Trismegistus. In this presentation, we will uncover how this secret occult teaching of the Hermetica, alongside alchemy, led him to the theory of gravity, which in turn has led him to be labelled by his peers as the last of the magicians and the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians to build the invisible intellectual world with the same eyes who began to build our intellectual world less than 10,000 years ago. Isaac Newton was born on the 25th of December 1642 in Woolsthorpe, near Grantham in England. At a young age, he showed great interest in mechanism and delighted in making machines such as a mini-house powered windmill. He later won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1661, where he was merely an average student. He later returned to Woolsthorpe, and it was there he began to think about the theory of gravity. The popular story is that after an apple fell off the tree, it sparked the idea in his mind that whatever caused that apple to fall also governed the motions of the other planets and therefore the Earth. He later returned to Cambridge, where he became a professor of mathematics in 1669 at the age of 27, and 2 years later was elected a member of the prestigious Royal Society, a scientific institution that is still thriving today. The Royal Society describes itself as a fellowship of many of the world's most eminent scientists and is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence. It continues to hold dominance on how the world looks at science and is a fellowship of some 1,600 of the world's most eminent scientists. It was once called the Invisible College of Natural Philosophers and operated as a secret society in its early beginnings. This society was founded by Robert Boyle and Robert Moray, well-known Freemasons, therefore connecting it to the secret society network. It was in 1684 Newton began his monumental achievement to date, the Principia. The Principia was itself revolutionary since it declared the natural philosophy was explicable and expressible in mathematical form. Astronomers such as Copernicus and Kepler had used mathematics and geometry, and Galileo had taken their application a step further. But to Newton, mathematics was the very heart of science. According to many, Isaac Newton's work on the Principia was the final proof of the Copernicus theory. Newton demonstrated that his theory of universal gravity accounted for Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which was in turn derived from Copernicus's heliocentric model. This set the seal for the heliocentric theory for many in the scientific community. The Principia became an immediate sensation. After it was published, Newton moved to London, where he became an overnight celebrity. He was knighted in 1705 by Queen Anne, the first scientist to be honoured in this way, and was elected President of the Royal Society in 1703, a position he retained until his death. He was a Member of Parliament for 2 short periods, and when he died in 1727, it was a cause of national mourning. After his death, his large catalogues of manuscripts written with his own hand was revealed. It also became an undeniable fact that his writings were alchemical in nature. Many believe alchemy to simply be the transition of base metals into gold, but it was actually man reaching for that forbidden knowledge in order for man to become an enlightened soul, to become as gods, as this other fellow alchemist describes it.
Newton wrote about alchemy more than science and math combined together. He believed that religion and science are inseparable. His main goal was to acquire the Philosopher's Stone, which he wrote its recipe in one of his writings. He was inspired by the chemist Robert Boyle, which also was an alchemist. Now these two great minds, Newton and Boyle, studying alchemy made me think that modern science should reconsider studying this type of science, which is called alchemy. Alchemy is the study of transmuting matter from a lower state to a more perfect state. But it's not just about matter. Alchemy is also about the spiritual type of the self. So it transmutes the metal spirit of the self to a golden spirit of the self. And that is what Newton was studying. That is what Newton was doing. And that is what Newton believed all of his inventions came from.
Most people have a very mistaken view of what alchemy is, based largely upon the caricatures of its enemies and the misunderstandings of the uninformed. In reality, alchemy was and is an advanced spiritual discipline, closely related to modern Wicca in its concepts and images. These concepts and images were presented in largely coded form so that they could be read by the unenlightened as relating to chemistry and physical operations, and by the enlightened as a system of spiritual wisdom. Thus, the true alchemist was not trying to turn ordinary lead into gold, though the casual observer might reasonably think so from how things were presented. Rather, they were striving to turn the lead of an ordinary and undeveloped consciousness into the gold of a fully realized and enlightened soul.
John Maynard Keynes, the leading 20th century economist and great collector of Newton's alchemical writings, who in paper read to the Royal Society in 1946, Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason. He was the last of the magicians. Interestingly enough, most of Newton's alchemical papers that were collected by John Keynes and others are now in Jerusalem in the Jewish National Library. They are written in secret, elaborate codes, and many of them have yet to be deciphered. In the past, alchemy was against the law and could even attract the death penalty, hence why some believe Newton hid under the garb of Christianity in order to avoid detection of his secret love for alchemy and the Hermetica.
Now, out of my own studies in secret societies, I know that back then in the 17th century there was a secret society called the Rosicrucians. They studied the same studies that Newton was studying, which made me think that Newton would have part of that secret society. They studied the Solomon's Temple. They studied Hermeticism, which believed the same as Newton said. This projection of heavens to earth, as above so below, comes from the Hermetic teachings, which Newton was studying, which also the Rosicrucians studied. He also studied the Kabbalah, which is a mystical Jewish study. Now, for those of you who do not know the Rosicrucians, the Rosicrucian is a mystery school. They teach many mystical religious studies like the Kabbalah, the Gnosticism, ancient Egyptian studies, Greek mythologies, and many other religious studies. And Newton studied the same exact studies as the Rosicrucians, which made me think that Newton might be having part of this Rosicrucian society, which was banned back then, because it had a lot of ideas outside of the mainstream Orthodox Christian religion. Like the Trinity, let's say. They didn't believe in the Trinity. Even Newton did not believe in the Trinity of Jesus. Newton believed that Jesus is like any human being, and anybody can reach what the Christ reached by making the vessel, this body we have, as a temple, as the studies of Kabbalah say, and hiring its state, its alchemical state, through virtues and righteousness. That is what Newton believed. So he did not believe that Christ is divine and this kind of divinity is only connected to him. He believed anybody can reach what Jesus reached, which was rejected by the Orthodox religion, Orthodox Christian religion. And that is why he kept it as a secret. He didn't want to publicize this kind of information. It was found later on in his writings. And it's also connected to the Rosicrucianism, because Rosicrucians believe the same.
Of Isaac Newton, it is written, like many of the esoterics before and after him, Newton was a great believer in the earliest civilizations such as Egypt. He was in no doubt that the Greeks learned everything they knew from Egypt. Newton frequently cited Hemes Trismegistus in his alchemical and esoteric private writings and wrote a detailed commentary on the Emerald Tablet, a tablet that is believed to have handed down from Hermes Trismegistus. Betty Jo Teeter Dobbs comments on the extent of Newton's passion for Hermes, explaining that Newton's study of Hermes Trismegistus extended over a period of 20 years, possibly longer. In the book The Forbidden Universe by Lynn Picknett and Clive Price, the authors write, "It is now recognized that it was not an apple falling on his head, or less dramatically, simply plummeting to the ground in front of him which gave him his eureka moment, but delving into the pages of Hermetica, and it bestowed on him nothing less than the key to unlock the mysteries of nature. It is not simply a matter of Newton hitting on the physical laws of nature by drawing analogies with the Hermetic principles. He applied those principles to the physical systems. For example, the big resistance to his explanation of gravity was that many considered it to be too occult. His notion of gravity as a force that acts across space at a distance and does so in the way it does purely as consequence of the nature of the universe was drawn straight from the magical laws of sympathy and attraction as expounded in the Hermetica. Newton put it more succinctly, declaring, "Gravity is God." The law of gravity invokes principles relating to forces that act between the earth and heavenly bodies that feature in very different language, of course, in Asclepius. It is the same work that inspired Copernicus. In a discussion of the mysteries of ancient Egypt, he wrote, "It was the most ancient opinion that the planets revolved around the sun, that the earth as one of the planets described an annual course about the sun, while by diurnal motion it turned on its axis, and that the sun remained at rest." The author in the book The Forbidden Universe then continues to write, "Of course, the obvious source for his understanding of the Egyptians is once again Asclepius and other Hermetic texts. If he had never become privy to Hermetica philosophy, he would never have achieved his work, and the world would literally be much the poorer for it. It is universally acknowledged that if the Principia had never been written, our modern technological world would not exist. But without Hermetica, Newton would never have written the Principia. Emphatically, Newton did not make his great scientific discoveries despite his esoteric beliefs, but because of them. So we see that it was the occult teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, ancient Egyptian theology, that led Newton to discover the theory of gravity. Now this poses a great dilemma for Bible-believing Christians. If there is a force called gravity, produced by the sun, that holds the planets, including the earth, in motion around the sun, then that would make the Bible a lie. As according to biblical texts of the Bible, the earth is stationary and cannot be moved. When the early Protestants heard about this new heliocentric theory, John Calvin wrote, "We will see some who are so deranged, not only in religion, but who in all things reveal their monstrous nature, that they will say that the sun does not move and that it is the earth which shifts and turns. When we see such minds, we must indeed confess that the devil possesses them, and that God sets them before us as mirrors in order to keep us in his fear. So it is with all who argue out of pure malice, and who happily make a show of their imprudence. When they are told that is hot, they will reply, no, it's plainly cold. When they are shown an object that it is black, they will say that it is white, or vice versa. Just like the man who said that snow is black, for although it is perceived and known by all to be white, yet he clearly wishes to contradict the fact. And so it is that they are madmen who will try to change the natural order, and even to dazzle eyes and benumb their senses." Alongside that, the Bible clearly warns against God's people in the Bible about going to Egypt to learn the secrets of the occult and the mystery religion. It is the reason why God called his people out of Egypt. Now, could alchemists and that old serpent the devil be right over the suggestion that God is trying to hide this knowledge because he wants to keep the knowledge to himself, as he does not want man to become like God? Or was God trying to protect his children from the deceptive lies of the serpent that he has handed down to his followers in order for them to doubt the very word of God and cause confusion? You will find the latter to be correct. The reason why God warned his children against following the ways of the Egyptians, the ways of the occult, is because it is a system founded on lies, and that also includes the theory of gravity, which we have already explained came direct from the Egyptian way of thinking. Though gravity is taught as a fact, it has never been proven. Note the following explanation as to the reason why objects rise and fall.
Gravity is an unproven theory made into an assumption and treated as a fact. The entirety of astrophysics begins with the assumption that gravity exists, then continues forward. It is in complete violation of sound scientific reasoning to bypass necessary verification of some aspect of science and regard it as fact. If we were to allow this violation of the necessity of proof required for gravity, science would immediately lose all its foundation of validity, because anything goes at that point. Up until this current day, gravity has never been detected, proven, observed, or even consistently mechanically defined. Since its conception, the theory of gravity has been described in three distinct ways. First by Newton as an inherent property of all matter, making all matter attracted to all other matter. Then later by Einstein as the curvature of space-time. And then finally by quantum theorists as a result of hypothesized subatomic particles called gravitons. If gravity was actually an inherent property of all matter, just imagine if that were the case. Do you think if you threw a handful of marbles in space, that all the marbles would start orbiting each other and stick to one another? Do you think they would then begin orbiting around and sticking to you, the relatively much more massive object? So everything you throw out into space would eventually just come back like a boomerang? Really? Scientism apologists will say that gravity is too weak between objects of human-sized proportions to exhibit any noticeable attraction to one another. But if that's the case, then how were the initial molecules attracted to one another that then later formed the Earth? If there is no observable attraction between a baseball and a tennis ball, then what causes the original hydrogen and helium atoms to attract one another? Now I know what your smartass is saying. Yeah, it's been detected. Watch this pen drop. But in order for that to be factual, you have to prove against all other rationale the reason that pen drops is uniquely the act of gravity and nothing else. To make matters even worse on you, by definition of gravity, you have to prove how all matter attracts all other matter indefinitely, and how that concept is why the pen is falling towards the ground. Imagine an empty plastic balloon dropping to the ground because gravity pulled it. Now, let's add mass to that empty plastic balloon, thus increasing the force of gravity. But this mass we add is gaseous, helium. Now let's release this once dropping balloon with the added mass of helium, which increases the force of gravity, and what happens? The balloon goes up? If gravity is pulling everything down towards the Earth, including the empty plastic balloon, why should adding more mass in the form of helium to that balloon suddenly cause gravity to be completely negated, allowing the balloon to rise? There is no force in physics that would propel an object in one direction, and if you increase that force, it sends the object completely in the opposite direction. It's just a fact of nature. If X amount of forces push an object Y amount of feet, then increasing X will only increase Y in the same direction, assuming both X forces are also in the same direction. So if the force of gravity pulls the empty balloon down, then adding mass to the balloon only increases the force of gravity in the same direction, yet the balloon travels completely against gravity all the way up into the sky and requires no fuel or energy input to do so. If gravity is a downward acceleration, then why would anything move upwards? Mainstream science claims that the reason the balloon moves upwards is because of buoyancy, which is a result of the heavier, more dense air being pulled under the helium balloon, thus making the balloon rise up, right? But on the flip side, don't they claim that all objects of different masses fall at the same rate? So why would gravity pull air molecules down harder or faster than it would the helium balloon if objects of different masses all fall at the same rate? Quite simply, a helium balloon is not pulled to the ground, as there is no mythical pulling force, nor is there a downward directional bias. Everything seeks its relative density with the medium surrounding it, and that is all. A feather and an anvil will both fall at different rates because one is radically denser than the air, while the other is not. This debunks the supposed uniform speed of acceleration due to gravity, 9.8 meters per second squared, which would more accurately be labeled something like the maximum acceleration towards density equilibrium. As long as something has enough mass and is aerodynamic enough to negate the air resistance of the fall, objects will fall at the same rate of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. When in a vacuum chamber, the factor of air resistance is removed completely, so everything, even feathers, balloons, and dandelion seeds, will fall at the same rate. Therefore, the change in rate of descent of objects clearly has nothing to do with mass, and has everything to do with the object's relative density to the medium surrounding it. Objects of different masses fall at the same rate in a vacuum because they are falling through the same medium, and the rate in which they do so is dependent on their relative density compared to that of the medium. Gravity is said to attract all matter with mass towards all other matter with mass. Now, if gravity is strong enough to pull an empty balloon down, then it must be strong enough to pull even lighter, less massive things, for the simple fact that mass is the measure of resistance something has to forces. Since gravity is a monopole inward pulling force, and more massive objects are less affected by the momentum caused by it, then gravity should have no trouble pulling helium particles towards the center of the Earth. They should in fact be much less trouble than pulling the molecular chains comprising rubber elastic polymers that constitute a toy balloon. Therefore, there should never be any anti-gravitation motions by any matter, seeing as gravity is only pulling one way and uniformly across all molecules. To think that the reason you are pressed to the ground is because the ground is constantly pulling you down is as flawed as saying a helium balloon rises because the ceiling is pulling it up. Clearly, in this example, it is not the ceiling of the auditorium pulling the balloon to it, because if you remove the ceiling, the balloon still rises, having nothing to do with the ceiling. So if this is true, and is proven to be so, then one can conclude that the reason we are pressed to the ground has nothing to do with the ground, but rather that the ground is just a barrier in the way of our trajectory down the density gradient. As anyone can test for themselves, as you remove the ground from under you, you continue to fall downward until you're met with more solid barrier matter. So if we were to remove the ground completely, we would descend down the density gradient until we reach the point of density equilibrium in which we would float freely amongst other similarly dense matter. And once this point is reached, particles can float about freely in whatever direction they want. Hence why air molecules, being in their density equilibrium point, neither fall nor rise, but rather flow about, freely moving whichever way the wind blows them. Now, as humans have a density equilibrium point a little above water, and hence why we fall through the gaseous atmosphere but float up in water, and coincidentally, while in water, we can move about in all three-dimensional directions, something we can't do in air, and this lines up perfectly with the scientific notion that we are upwards of 70% water, which would mean that the remaining 30% of us that isn't water is comprised of matter less dense than water, and hence why we float in it. And although some of that matter, like bone matter, is more dense, other parts, like the air in our lungs, and therefore all throughout our bloodstream, average out the remaining 30% of non-water matter. Now, one must realize that it takes no energy to remain afloat on water, like when doing a backfloat, but it takes much energy for birds, for instance, to stay airborne in the air, because they are not at their density equilibrium point when flying.
So I hope you see why John Maynard labels Isaac Newton as the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. Note that he dates the beginning of this intellectual inheritance as being passed down less than 10,000 years ago. Here he is taking us back to its origins, back to Egypt. And he labels him as a magician because he has done a marvellous work of convincing the world into believing a reality that does not even exist. It is pure witchcraft and sorcery. A spell has been placed on the whole world into believing a made-up reality which does not even exist. In Revelation 18, there is a call for God's people to come out of Babylon. However, Babylon is also a product of Egypt. The one who is known to have founded the system of Babylon is Nimrod. However, Nimrod's grandfather Ham and his descendants populated Egypt and the surrounding areas, hence why the Bible refers to Egypt as the land of Ham. This mystery occult religion that comes from Egypt has been passed down to the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, right down to the Roman Catholic Church. Is it not interesting that those who have shaped the modern scientific world through what's known as the Great Scientific Revolution were Catholics and Catholic priests? Today, the Roman Catholic Church has a whole shrine and centre dedicated to the ancient Egyptians. This is all in fulfillment with Bible prophecy, as we are told in Daniel 11 verse 43, "But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps." This includes the fact that Rome holds the secrets and the mysteries to this ancient occult religion, as other alchemists have also pointed out. God's call today is for his people to come out of this false religion. Out of Egypt I have called my son. This also applies to us. In the times of ignorance, God winked, but as knowledge is increasing and light is shining on the word of God, God is urgently calling his people to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them.